The underlying psychology, the reason why you're a fan of these things is the same, right? You're in it for a recreation. You do it because it's fun. You do it because the community is fun. You do it for a little bit of escapism, right? You do it to flex some of those self-expression or creativity muscles. Those same underlying psychological motivations are there. So the differences are quite literally skin deep here, right? They're small, superficial aesthetic differences. We have a lot more in common than you might think. And when you keep that in mind, it's a lot easier, especially if you're a fan of anything, right? If you're a fan of something, I feel like you can understand a furry.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, Kayla.
I have a question for you.
You always have a question for me.
I do often have a question for you.
But on this show, it's always, not often.
I guess that's true, yeah.
Yeah.
So my question for you today is, what do you know about furries?
Furries. Are we doing furries? We're doing furries.
What do you know about furries? And actually,
okay, I
wait,
know they
hold
exist.
On. Let me stop you there.
Well, you said you can ask me a question.
I want you to really think about it.
Like, do you want me to really think about furries?
What do you really actually know about furries and the furry community?
Okay, now that you're putting it that way, very little.
Same.
When you say the word actually that way, when I think about it, I'm like, I know what other people have said about furries. I know what like has leaked into the sort of discourse about like, oh, some furry convention had Nazis at it. And I know that like furries are just like have like a big target on their backs for making fun of a lot of the time. But in terms of like from the horse's mouth, from the horse's mouth, because they're furries, I didn't even mean that. But from that perspective, I guess I don't really actually know that much firsthand primary source wise.
So for those of us listening who may not know, a furry is essentially a fan of anthropomorphic animals. So
isn't it in like a sexual sense, though?
We will get to that.
Oh.
Maybe you've seen pictures of people dressed up in mascot-like suits depicting themselves as cats or cows or horses. And if cat dogs. And if you've lived on the internet for any amount of time, you may have come across this community and formed some opinions, much like you or I have. Like what you just said about how things have leaked out to you, or that's your knowledge of the furry community is just kind of what you've heard, what people have told you, what people who aren't in the community have told you, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly. Like, I have lots of second-hand knowledge, but not anything first-hand. I do have two questions for you, though.
Yes.
First question. Didn't you say in I think it was actually the Tulpa episode, maybe, that didn't we talk about bronies once? Like, not as a topic.
We've definitely mentioned bronies on the show.
From the furry community?
Or
was it Tulpas came from the brony community?
I think it was something like Tulpas, as we, like the Tulpa practice that we know of, like on Reddit and whatnot, grew out of the brony community.
Okay, so then the connection to furries is not there, just in my own stupid brain.
Not necessarily.
Oh, okay.
I will say that there is maybe a connection between furries and bronies.
Okay.
But again, we will get to that.
Okay, so the second question.
Yes.
Is this your Halloween-themed episode because it's people dressing up as something else?
Because it's people dressing up. Yes, that is a tangential reason why this is the Halloween episode. It's got nothing to do with Halloween.
I love season.
But there are some people some percentage of the population dresses up for Halloween. Some percentage of the furry population dresses up. There's your overlap.
Okay.
For some reason, there is a tendency for... And you've experienced this, I've experienced this. There's a tendency for outsider information and opinions on furries to, like, not be super complimentary.
Yeah.
Like, you and I, who are not furries, like, the motivations of the people who participate in this community, not super well understood. There are sometimes sexual connotations involved that could make some people uncomfortable. And it's just something that's kind of out of the realm of, like, mainstream everyday experience.
Yeah. You know what it kind of feels like? It kind of feels like furries are like fair game. You know what I mean? It kind of feels like...
Why does it feel like that?
I don't know why it feels like that. And now that I'm saying that that's the feeling, that makes me feel like it's kind of mean. Because it's like...
Do you want me to make you feel even worse?
Why are they fair game? Like, there's lots of weirdos out there.
There are.
We've talked about weirder stuff on this show.
There are, yeah.
So what is it about furries that just kind of makes it be like, oh yeah, everybody can make fun of them? Like, that kind of sucks.
Yeah, do you want me to make you feel even worse?
No.
We will get into this, but people who are furries have a much higher percentage of having experienced bullying as kids.
Oh, cool. Great. Awesome.
Much, much higher than non-furries. And it is a largely queer community.
Okay, good. This is getting better. Yeah,
and
awesome.
high
Great.
representation of autistic people.
Oh, okay. That's nailed it. Trifecta.
So I think that
sucks.
explains in some ways why there is this feeling of quote unquote fair game. You and I aren't consciously sitting there going, well, it's a bunch of like neurodivergent queer people who were bullied, so they're fair game. But perhaps the reason why that fair game feeling persists is because of these like kind of insidious systemic issues.
Right. Like it definitely feels all related to that. Back to the things you were just saying, even though I didn't know those facts though, right? Like I didn't know that it was primarily queer, neurodivergent history of bullying. It does make sense that those things would somehow be tied into like why that community kind of feels that way. But yes, now I feel worse. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good reminder that anytime there is some sort of like mainstream bashing of a group, like it's probably likely that there's some like marginalization going on there. Yeah. Okay. Covering topics on this show has helped me think differently about some communities that I know little about and maybe have had like opinions that were colored in by less than friendly sources. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about tulpas here. We already talked about tulpas. Like when I initially found about tulpas, I definitely had a stigmatized view and had my mind changed and realized how like wrong I was.
Right. Like the view prior to doing that research was just kind of like,
look at this weird thing.
Are they giving themselves DID? Like what's going on here?
Yeah. And just a reminder, tulpas are like adult imaginary friends. It also kind of reminded me a little bit of like Empty Spaces. I remember that like loosely knit group of queer and traumatized writers on Twitter.
Yeah. That was more, I was just confused until until I came to the epiphany that I was supposed to be confused.
Yeah.
But it's okay.
These groups are beautiful things. Like we are very pro these groups on this show.
Oh, hell yeah.
And we've been
I think like half our audience is tulpas.
I hope so. I love the tulpas. Like
literally they listen to our show.
I know. It's amazing.
Non-physical,
I know.
Non-corporeal beings listen to our podcast.
It's the best.
It's rad.
Like we are really lucky that we got to learn about these things and have our opinions kind of more our opinions rounded out about these various groups.
Yeah, or like when we did QAnon and now I really like QAnoners, you know?
Nope. No.
What about Jatarth? He was cool.
Are you not a QAnoner anymore? He's one of the ones that got away.
He was an escapee.
So because of these experiences, I wanted to get to know the furry community and see if there were some similarities there between other groups that we've gotten to know and love.
Mm-hmm. Did you have to infiltrate by like dressing up like a hawk cat or something?
Not yet.
Okay.
But spoiler alert, of course, those similarities are there.
Okay.
I love this group. I had a tremendously interesting and informative conversation with someone who both participates in and researches the furry community. And I want you to dive into this journey with me to learn more about the wonderful world of furries.
So you got a primary source?
Yes.
Hell yeah.
Yes.
Oh, thank God. I finally get to like actually know what's going on with this.
This is Kayla.
And this is Chris.
And this is Cult or Just Weird. Awesome. Then I will start with the first question. So first of all, can you introduce yourself to our listeners? We like to do names, pronouns, and whatever else you'd like to share about your job or your life or what's going on.
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm Dr. Courtney Plant. I am a social psychologist and professor at Bishop's University in Sherbrooke, Canada. I am the co-founder and lead data analyst of Fur Science, a team of interdisciplinary scientists who study the furry fandom. And I am a furry myself, so I can speak both as a person who studies this stuff and as an insider in the fandom, I suppose.
I'm not sure how much preamble I'm going to do before we play the interview, sure. But for our listeners, what is a furry, and is what is the preferred terminology in the community?
Yeah, so there's we often joke in the fandom that there's if you ask 10 different furries, you get 11 different answers for what a furry is. The mostly kind of agreed upon answer is that furries are people who are fans of furry content, which sounds a little circular. But if you imagine science fiction fans are fans of science fiction, football fans are fans of football, furries are fans of any media that has anthropomorphic animal characters. And it's just a big $20 word that just means animals that walk and talk and do human things. So if you grew up with Bugs Bunny or Mickey Mouse or watch that film Zootopia, it's got animals that walk and talk and do human things. That's what furries are a fan of.
Gotcha. Okay. I feel like I need to revisit the Zootopia question because I've definitely seen that talked about in regards to the community. So I know I didn't put that in our questions, but I'll try to revisit that. So that begs the question. You talked about your job. You talked about what a furry is. So what is fur science? What exactly is the work that you and your colleagues do there?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways I could answer that. The best way is that we started off as fandom researchers. So let me back up. So we're a team of interdisciplinary social scientists. So we've got a social psychologist on the team. We've got sociologists, clinicians, anthrozoologists. But we all have this sort of converging point of being interested in furries for various reasons. So myself and my colleague, Dr. Stephen Rayson, we are fan researchers. So a lot of the research that's out there in psychology, if you want to study fans, you have to study sports fans. That's kind of the default fan. And we're like, well, hey, there's literally everything else you can be a fan of besides just sports fans. And we think that maybe you're missing something by comparing everyone to a sport fan. And so we go out of our way to try to study other fan interests that maybe are less studied. So anime fans, My Little Pony fans, and furries fall into that list. So that's sort of our interest. But, my anthrozoology colleague, Dr. Kathleen Gerbasi, she studies human-animal interactions, right? So things like pets or service animals or, people's ethics, how they feel ethically about the use of animals for product testing. So she's interested in wow, these furries have a novel way of relating to animals. That's very different from how the average person does. What's that all about? And, my colleague, Dr. Sharon Roberts, studies identity formation. So how do adolescents and teenagers, as they make the path into adulthood, how do they answer these big questions about who am I and how do I belong in the world and what communities do I belong to? And so for her, she's fascinated by some of the more unusual roads people take to sort of figuring out who they are and how that, despite being a little unusual in superficial appearance, these communities are nevertheless beneficial. So we all answer different kinds of questions coming into it, but we have in common this shared interest in using the furry fandom as a vehicle to answer some really interesting questions about human nature.
So what did you study in school to be able to follow this path as your career?
So myself, I'm a social psychologist. So I I got a Bachelor of Science with an honors specialization in psychology. I went to graduate school for 5 years to be a social psychologist, and then I did a 2-year postdoc continuing on in media and social psychology. So social psychology as a field, for those who don't know, it is a bit of a field that a lot of folks don't know about. This is the study of how the situation or the environment and the people in it affect the way we think, feel, and behave. So whereas a clinician might study, mental illness, or a cognitive psychologist might study, how pathways in the brain make you think a certain way, I study how the environment affects us and how people in that environment change the way we think and understand ourselves.
How do you study something like that? A question that I'm really interested in is how does fur science carry out scientific research into this community? I don't know much about these various sciences. So yeah, how do you, what do you do? What is your methodology?
So what does research look like in this field? Yeah, that's a really good question that we don't actually get asked very much. Surprisingly, no one asks to see the the paperwork or the receipts.
Oh, interesting.
So it's a combination. So one of the things you recognize if you take a research methods course is that there's no one right way to do a study. There's no one perfect way to study something, because every approach you take is necessarily flawed. There will always be there are no perfect studies, as I would tell my students. So what we instead do is you try to take a number of different approaches to answering a question, so that even though each approach has its own limitation, they all have their own strengths as well. So some of our data is collected through surveys. Sometimes we'll go to a furry convention and pass out 2,000 surveys to furries there. Other times we'll do online questionnaires and say, hey, furries who can't make it to a furry convention, do our survey. But there are some things surveys can't do. So sometimes we'll do longitudinal studies where we'll track the same furries over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years even, and see, hey, how have you changed in 5 years? How has the fandom changed you? Other times we'll do experiments. We'll actually do like reaction time experiments. We've actually gone to conventions before and set up like an on-site computer lab with reaction time experiments and say, okay, we're going to show a picture on the screen in a split second, you have to make a decision, one or the other. And so we can measure things like how does your mind work on the order of milliseconds. So there's no one, we've done studies where we've taken scans of people's hands, like, put their hands on a photocopier to measure things like digit ratios, which is kind of a proxy for things like prenatal testosterone exposure. Like there's a ton of different things that you can measure when you use different methodologies. We've done focus groups, one-on-one interviews, just casual observations. So you name it, and we've done that different type of methodology, because again, no one research methodology can answer all of the questions we have.
Okay, so this is the coolest job.
It's up there with being a myth buster, I think, in terms of how cool it is.
Yeah. That's, oh man, that sounds like you have just something really cool to look forward to every day kind of thing.
There are very few jobs where you get to like go to a furry convention and call it part of your job. Right.
I have a question. Earlier this season, we did an entire episode about suicidality and suicide awareness. And not that we're going to go heavy on that right now, but we had an interview with another professor, somebody who works in academia, and she said the phrase, research is me search. And so what does that mean to you? If somebody who is part of this fandom who studies it, it just feels like research is me search is real here.
I think there's something to that idea, although in a very literal sense, I guess that's true. Insofar as when I got to graduate school, they said, okay, what are you going to study? You have to do your master's thesis on something. And because I was very lazy, I kind of looked to my surroundings. I said, well, I play a lot of video games and I go to furry conventions, so I would like to study video games and furries. And no one stopped me, which was pretty cool. So I did my thesis in video games and I published papers on furry conventions. But I guess it didn't necessarily stem from... I know there's that belief, for example, if you go into clinical psychology, that you're trying to... the stereotype is that you're trying to understand your own hurts, your own pains. Mm-hmm. I think more so it was just because maybe it was a bit of low-hanging fruit. It's just, this is what I did for a hobby. And so I felt like, well, if I'm going to go to furry conventions anyways, I might as well, bring a box of surveys to the table and be able to do that. But it wasn't, right. At least for myself, I don't see it as being a super deep dive into understanding myself. I see it as a hobby. And, even if I wasn't a furry, I would be doing this. And I know that because in addition to my furry research, I also study anime fans and Star Wars fans and My Little Pony fans. And I don't really consider myself to be a big Star Wars fan or a big anime fan. So,
gotcha.
Fan research is fan research. If you do it long enough, eventually you'll hit a thing that you're a fan of, and you study that as well.
Well, it's just so interesting for you to say that, like, the research into fandom so far is somewhat limited to sports fans. When I think of fandom, sports fans is not the first thing that I think of. Obviously, that's a huge fandom and it's very mainstream. But when I think of fandom, I'm thinking of more like the genre fandom. So it's interesting to me that this is understudied and just seems like that seems like fertile ground then for this research to flourish.
I suppose I need to back up a teensy bit there. I might have misspoke a little bit. It's specifically in social psychology.
Gotcha.
The research
okay.
focused predominantly, specifically on fan hooliganism. I don't know what it was, but for whatever reason, fan psychologists in like the 90s were obsessed with why football fans in Europe rioted. That was the big question. But if you went into other fields, so if you went into communications or, media studies, for sure, people like Henry Jenkins have been studying Star Trek fans for decades. But specifically in my field, I should say that they were focused too much on sports fans and not enough on anything else. And that's changed now since the late 2000s. That's changed. I don't want to throw anyone under the bus or pretend that it hasn't gotten better. But certainly when we first started, that was definitely in need for some change.
So can we talk a little bit about the history of, since we talked about the little history of the fandom in social psychology, can we talk about the history of the fur fandom itself? Like, I know that's probably difficult to pinpoint. Like, I'm sure there's been interest in anthropomorphic animals throughout all of human history. But when did fur fandom start? Like, how long has it been around? Where did it start? How has it grown? Mm-hmm. Anything you can give me on that, I'm really interested.
Yeah, so what's interesting is there have actually been a number of different documentaries and people who've attempted to nail down where did it start. And again, depending on how far you want to go back, some will say, well, it started when the first cave people painted pictures on the walls of animal-like deities.
Right.
More contemporarily, where a lot of furries tends to put the start of it, is in the late 1970s, where it was actually an offshoot of the science fiction fandom.
Oh.
So furry makes a lot more sense when you understand that's where it came from. So a lot of the norms, a lot of the customs. What would happen is you would go to these science fiction conventions, and somewhere within the bowels of these science fiction conventions, you would find, a room specifically for people who wanted to go to a panel about, stories where you crash land on a planet full of walking, talking cat people, right? That's a trope in science fiction. So there would always be something like that at a science fiction convention. And eventually, enough of these folks would be, they sort of gathered together that they started to do room parties at these science fiction conventions. And they would pass around art. They would start these little zines or zines, however you pronounce it, the independent publications where they'd pass around stories and artwork. And eventually there was sort of a critical mass of them where they said, hey, we're doing one or two panels or these little room parties at science fiction conventions. Why don't we just do our own convention? And so in the late 70s, that's exactly what they did. They kind of had their first small convention at a hotel, and it sort of grew legs from there. Throughout the 80s, they were small but kind of scattered. The convention really didn't get too much traction. It was like if you didn't know someone, if you didn't have an entry point into it, it was really hard to stumble onto it. But it really took off in the 90s with the advent of the internet, and suddenly you can stumble upon furry artwork, furry stories, and discover, there's these meetups of people just like me that I didn't even know there was a name for. And so you saw the rapid growth and proliferation of furry story and art sharing websites and the mass growth of furry conventions into what it is today.
Where does the community live on the internet these days? Like, if I wanted to get started in the community, like, am I going to Reddit? Like, where am I going?
Yeah, so you'll find furries kicking around wherever you'll find most tech culture. So furries, there's the sort of online joke that furries make the internet go, because furries are like if you go with the idea that furries stemmed from science fiction fans. Well, science fiction fans are very tech savvy. They were some of the first to adopt to the internet for things like MUX, multi-user dungeons, and chat rooms and chat boards and stuff. So very early on, furries were very immersed in internet culture. So pretty much wherever you find internet culture, you'll find furries. There are furry Reddits. There are 4chan infamously has a quote-unquote furry infestation that will never go away.
Nice.
Furries have been on image boards like DeviantArt. Eventually, furries kind of made their own image boards like Fur Affinity. There are furry chat groups. There are VR right now is absolutely popular for furries. So pretty much wherever you find internet culture, you'll find some flavor of furry taking up a spot somewhere in the corner of it.
Why do you think there is such overlap with the furry community with other communities? Like you obviously walked us through why there's overlap with like sci-fi, fan convention going, but like you also talked about My Little Pony and anime fans, and if they're everywhere on the internet, like why do you think this overlap is so prominent?
So I think the overlap is there because furries are first and foremost geeks, nerds. And you'll notice with any aspect of nerd culture, there's a tremendous overlap, right? So if you're an anime fan, there's also a fairly good chance you're a fan of fantasy or science fiction or, something along those lines, right? If you're a science fiction fan, you probably also dabble a little bit in some of these other genres. So I think furry kind of gets rolled up in that insofar as you're a nerd, you like the things that nerds like, which tend to be a lot of these different media-based fandoms, right? So the big ones for furries are science fiction because that's kind of where furries originated from, but also anime, My Little Pony, because there's conceptually overlap between, if you're a fan of walking, talking animal characters, well, a show about walking, talking horses kind of falls into that category. Yeah, but also, anytime you see writing, science fiction, fantasy, that sort of thing, furries really glom onto that. Gaming culture, there have rather famously been some top-tier world-class gamers who are also furries, so...
That's so interesting. I love that. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. We've talked about My Little Pony a couple times. We have not covered the, quote unquote brony phenomenon on the show yet. We have talked about it. Is there overlap with those specific communities, or are brony quote unquote fans separate from the furry community?
Yeah, so that was actually a question that we were asking ourselves because we studied bronies and furries. And when it first came out, furries and bronies had a really mixed sort of feeling towards one another.
Interesting.
Because you had furries who would get really pissed off and they would say, look at all, when it first came out, I think about 20% of furries considered themselves to be bronies. And so furries who weren't My Little Pony fans would get pissed off because they would say, look at this, I'm trying to look at furry art, I'm trying to read furry stories, and everything is just My Little Pony crap right now. Mm-hmm. I don't want to see, I'm not a brony, I don't want to see any of this. So furries had this perception that My Little Pony was invading the fandom. Okay. And likewise, if you were a brony, there was not so flattering media at the time about furries. And so, some bronies were like, hey, don't lump us in with those weirdos, the furries. So it was kind of like throwing furries under the bus and trying to avoid the stink and the stigma of furries. In part because bronies themselves were being stigmatized as being a little bit too weird. So nowadays, I'm happy to say they get along pretty well. With the ending of the most recent generation of the show, My Little Pony, a lot of bronies have found that brony conventions are starting to close up. The big one, BronyCon, is now sort of gone. So a lot of bronies are slowly kind of walking over to brony conventions to be among like-minded people. So they're on good terms today.
Gotcha. That's really nice to hear. It's really nice to hear. It's like... there's obviously a lot, or there has historically been stigma towards both the groups on the internet, so at least I'm glad that they can get along.
Yeah.
So then I kind of have the same question about Zootopia. Like, obviously, when Zootopia came out, I feel like there was a lot of, amongst a certain set of the internet, there was a lot of humor about like, oh, this is something that appeals to furries. And then also it does seem like there has been appeal to furries with Zootopia.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. What's going on there? How should we be feeling about Zootopia?
So one of the things that furries often struggle with is trying to explain to people what they're a fan of, right? So you ask a furry and it's like, well, what is it that you're a fan of? And a lot of furries like trying to explain anthropomorphic animals to people and how you can be a fan of that. The go-to was often like, well, okay, Mickey Mouse, Bugs Bunny. Those are the go-tos. But for a lot of people that, they go, I watched Bugs Bunny when I was like 6 years old or whatever. Zootopia was like one of the... They absolutely nailed it. It was like if you were to take a cross-section of furry culture and like what a furry story or a furry fantasy might look like, this idea of a completely realized world where like animals walk and talk and do human things. They go work animal jobs. They deal with some of the stereotypes that have to do with one particular species over another. Like that's all perfectly enmeshed and realized in this world of Zootopia. So for many furries, it was like this beautiful, like that's it. Now we have something that we can point to and say, that's the thing we've been talking about, right? The thing that we try to capture in our fan fiction or in our artwork or in our virtual chats or whatever. That's the thing that we want, right? Like what would it be like to live in a world where like a walking, talking fox can sit on the bus next to a rabbit and they can, talk or whatever.
Right.
This certainly wasn't the only touchstone. So if you go back historically, there's a sort of running joke that you can tell when a furry got into the fandom, depending on sort of what Disney movie was responsible for them getting into furry. So
okay.
Initially it was like Disney's Robin Hood with the foxes.
Oh, absolutely.
Then it was, then it was fast forward a few decades, and it was The Lion King.
Okay.
If you sort of grew up in the 90s, then it was Sonic the Hedgehog was mixed in there, Pokemon was mixed in there a bit, but Zootopia was kind of like the most recent touchstone for that.
The Disney's Robin Hood, like, I know so many people. Furries. Yeah, I mean, I know so many people who aren't furries that are like, oh yeah, that I love those characters. Like, I'm in love with Robin Hood. Like, I love these guys, and would never in a million years make a connection to maybe that's why some people are interested in, or like maybe that's what being a furry is about, or at least is a gateway to it. I just think that making that connection, that's a good one. People will get that one for sure.
Well, and that's just it too. Is we grow up with these things. Like most of us have fond memories of like Saturday morning cartoons. Most of us can think of whether it's Tony the Tiger on your cereal box or playing Sonic the Hedgehog. For me, it was Star Fox. I loved the game Star Fox. I'm like, man, this is cool. Spaceships shooting lasers and also being a fox. That's kind of cool. But we have these fond memories, and some people grow up and grow out of these interests, whereas other people continue to very unironically embrace them. And I think it's a really important thing that often gets lost, is we live in a very cynical, very ironic time right now where people will spite watch television, and it's kind of nice. We saw this with My Little Pony. It's kind of nice to have a show that's just kind of a nice, pleasant show to watch, right? Or to have a little fantasy that you can go to that's not tainted by the cynicism and general shittiness of the world around us, right? Let's go back to those Saturday morning cartoons. And that's been a nice trend we've seen in recent years where you see adults more openly embracing I can like superhero movies. Yeah, I can like Star Wars and be 40 years old, and that's okay.
Have you watched We Bare Bears?
I have not.
Oh, We Bare Bears, for me, is really hitting that sweet spot of just like, this is a nice, pleasant show where nice, pleasant things happen, and the characters I love watching them, and they're just friends with each other, and highly recommend if you ever get a chance to watch We Bare Bears.
Nice.
Yeah.
It's just nice.
It's just nice. So I guess I haven't asked you yet, what brought you to the fandom? You mentioned Star Fox. Is that where it started for you, or is there something else?
It's really hard to pin. I mean, when you ask furries, again, every furry has a different entry point, a different thing that did it for them. I don't think there was any one particular moment. I grew up liking cartoons and liking games like Star Fox. I think if I had to point to one thing, Pokemon would probably be the closest. There was
cool.
For those who listen, there's a Pokemon called Mewtwo, and it was basically an anthropomorphic cat, and I didn't know what furry was. I was like 13. I'm like, whatever reason, that cat-looking thing that walks and talks and is really badass looking, that looks really cool. So I started drawing fan art of him and putting pictures of him on my locker and looking for like pictures online of people who drew this. And it wasn't until years later that a friend was like, oh, that's furry art. You're a furry. I'm like, what is a furry? And I discovered, oh my gosh, there's an entire community that I've just been oblivious to that likes this stuff.
I love that. So it's like you came to it organically, like you created it for yourself before you even knew that there was a community, and then discovered the community. And
a remarkable number of furries, well, not so much these days, but certainly if you grew up in the 90s, for a lot of furries, they describe their induction into the fandom as a complete accident, right? They're looking for fan arts or stories about one thing, and only by accident do they stumble into the fact that the fandom exists. It's nowadays it's a little easier for kids who grow up always online to find this stuff. It's more talked about.
So do you think there's some sort of do you think there's something inherent about the human condition and like furry fandom? Like I think a lot about how there are, like if I think about dreams or sleep paralysis, I know, stay with me, this does connect. There are shared tropes throughout various cultures throughout time. There are shared tropes in nightmares and sleep paralysis, like of the cat sitting on your chest, of shadow people, of those kinds of things. And so it makes me think, okay, there's some part of the shared human condition that is giving rise to these tropes being prevalent for people. So I'm wondering, do you think that there's something like that if people are coming to this organically, if it is sparking something in people before they even know it's a thing, do you think there's just something inherent in the human condition that can give rise to being a furry?
I think so. If I could try a little experiment with you, we'll see if there's some truth to this idea. I'm eager to try this.
Ooh, yes, please.
Okay, I want you to try to guess, knowing absolutely nothing about, or very little about the fandom, I would say. if you had to guess what the most common fursona species, a fursona is a character that you identify with. If you had to guess, what are the most common species? Take a guess throw out a couple species that you think are the most common among furries.
I would think fox or cat.
So you just guessed like the second and fourth most common species in the fandom.
Really?
Just intuitively.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Throw out a few more.
It is hard to not be biased here because I did know somebody back in college who their fursona was an orca whale, and I always thought that was really fascinating. I don't think that's one of them. I'm going to say dog.
Dog is like number 3, yeah. Or actually dog's number 1.
Dog's number 1.
Depends if you lump them in with wolves. If you lump them in with wolves/dogs are number 1.
Okay, wolf was going to be my next guess.
Yeah.
So okay, wolf/dog, and then after that, I don't even know. I mean, are we then getting into like? Are birds can you be a furry bird?
Avians are in the top 15 or so.
Oh, wow.
I guess the point of the demonstration is to suggest that, there's when you look across cultures, there are certain animal species that resonate with us, right? So that they imbue our language. We describe people as being catty, right? Describing cats, or bitchy, which is a term for dogs, right? We talk about, monkeying around. We understand ourselves. We use, sometimes cringily, we use alpha wolf and alpha male. We describe large gay men as bears. It permeates our language. It permeates how we understand ourselves. We keep small animals in our houses with us, right? Mm-hmm. We communicate with them, or some of us communicate with them, or try to talk to our cats or our dogs. Look historically around the world at stories, and whether you're looking at East Asian culture or European culture, you'll see the same, dragons and foxes and kitsune. You see this in the deities that we had over here among the indigenous tribes, right? Bears were very common, and wolves, the tricksters of foxes. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that no matter where you go, the same handful of species and the same sorts of tropes and ideas and stories sort of permeates. So I think this is just part of being a human, is to look outside of us at the species near us and try to understand the world and understand ourselves by understanding them. Right? They're literally the only other thing on this planet that we can point to that's alive like we are.
Right. And just, it is fascinating. I think about this a lot because I'm a pet person. Like, I have 3 cats. I think a lot about how some of my most profound relationships have been with the animals that live in my house that I cannot communicate with. But the love that a pet can give you is so unconditional. It is so different than other kinds of relationships, and you're able to achieve that bond without even having the luxury of communication you can have with another person. So that makes a lot of sense to me, for sure.
I would say in the average person, the framework, the raw resources are there to be a furry. It's just whether or not you have the intrinsic interest to go out and actively pursue a fan interest in it. In the same way that, a lot of people like chocolate, but not everyone likes chocolate enough to go pursue some course in chocolate taste testing, or to learn how to cook 100 meals that use dark chocolate. Or you can like coffee, or you can be like a coffee snob who spends way too many hours getting a French press so you can brew just the perfect cup of coffee, right? And again, you can either just like this stuff, or you can like it enough that it becomes a part of your identity. But I think to the average person, the thing that furries like is there. It's just they don't go that extra step to making it a part of their identity. But, I can like hockey and not be a hockey fan.
Sure. Yeah. So then who does make up the furry community? Like, what is the demographic?
So the fandom tends to lean rather young. Again, usually where you find a lot of nerd culture. So fairly young. We tend to find it tends to lean a little bit more male than female. One of the most defining features of the furry fandom, though, is it's incredibly LGBTQ. So we find, for example, trans people are represented in the fandom about 20 times more commonly than they are in the general public.
Wow, okay.
The fandom is more bisexual and gay than it is straight. Mm-hmm. So it's this tremendous LGBTQ space. This is not to say, of course, that there aren't obviously like 30% straight people in the fandom. But it does have this very strong LGBTQ flavor to it. And again, part of this, I would say, is its origins in the science fiction fandom, right, which has been historically very progressive on these sorts of issues. I mean, Star Trek was fairly pioneering in a lot of these more progressive issues culturally, but also in the cities where it popped up, cities like San Francisco, cities like Toronto were some of the first major hubs where you found furry conventions and furry get-togethers. And so, it's not a coincidence that from baked into the crust right from the beginning of the furry fandom was this notion of like, hey, we're open and accepting. We're all weirdos here. We're all geeks and nerds, and we come from different walks of life. If I'm going to be a cartoon cat and you're going to be a cartoon dragon, why would we make fun of each other for being gay or being trans? Right? It's
right. It's interesting. We just did a couple episodes ago. We did an episode on a community that largely lives on Twitter called Empty Spaces. And it is a loose-knit community of flash fiction writers who are largely queer, largely trans, largely have some sort of trauma, and have bonded over shared tropes in their writing. And that was actually one of the first places that I turned to when we started researching this episode. I wanted to ask them, like, is there overlap between the furry community and your community because of that shared demographic of like largely being queer, largely being trans? And I know for Empty Spaces, it kind of just touching on what you were saying, for Empty Spaces, a lot of why the fans of that community have flocked together is because of that like baseline level of acceptance. Like you're already engaging in something that is outside of the mainstream, that is in some ways diametrically opposed to the mainstream or unaccepted by the mainstream. Yep. And so it becomes this safe space I know that phrase has kind of been demonized in certain parts of our culture. I still very much love it. Do you think the furry community or fur fandom is a safe space for people who need it?
100%. I would say that, like, when you were describing there, I'm like, that you could have taken that exact description and put it onto the furry fandom and been 100% accurate. Absolutely.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
One of the things I tell people when I'm talking about this is that a lot of furries were people who came from being bullied. Right? You were the ostracized kid in class. You were the kid who was a little bit too weird. You liked cartoons just a little bit too late. You liked Pokemon when it wasn't cool to like Pokemon anymore. Right? You drew unicorns when that was like something that 5-year-olds did. So you had this sort of history of being bullied or ostracized or not quite fitting in. And for whatever reason, and here you find the fandom, which is come as you are, right? So when you're here, you're family, be yourself here, and that's okay. And so for many of them, this is the first place where they've been accepted.
Right. Yeah, that's why I'm glad that these communities exist. Like, it is so easy to not be accepted by mainstream society. Like, we've got to make these pockets where, like, that kind of bullshit doesn't creep in.
Well, and what's worse, and my colleague, Dr. Sharon Roberts, could speak more to this, but we live in a time right now where people really struggle to find identity, right? You look at, and part of the reason why we see people, it's almost like adolescence lasts longer and longer. We see people going into their mid-20s, even their late 20s, and feeling like they're not ready to adult, so to speak. Right. And I think it's because they're still struggling with these fundamental questions of where do I fit into this big, weird, constantly changing world that's just getting harder and harder to nail down your place in. And the fandom for a lot of folks is scaffolding. It provides that stability. It gives you a label. It gives you a community to belong to and a place to start experimenting with facets of yourself and trying on different identities, trying on different parts of yourself. Maybe you're questioning, I don't know if I'm gay, I don't know if I'm trans, but now here's a space where I can try on a different set of pronouns for a while. I can try on, maybe I'm more of a humorous person. Maybe I'm a bit of a goof, or maybe I'm an artist. And you can try these things out and see, does this work? Does this jive? No, well, maybe I'll go back to the drawing board. But I'm in a safe space. I'm in a place where there's this sort of fantasy theme, so everything can be tried in sort of a jokey, lighthearted way to test the waters, like dipping your foot in the pool.
It's reminding me of a conversation I was having with somebody from the Empty Spaces community of just like respectability and how freeing it is when you can kind of embrace the fact that you don't need to pursue respectability in some ways. Like
it's just really, as a given.
Yeah. So I guess I should ask, how does someone engage or participate in the community? Like, we've talked about conventions, we've kind of talked about fan art and things like that, but if somebody is a furry, what are they doing to be a furry?
Yeah, so that one really throws people off because for the same reason, if I ask you to picture a Star Wars fan, what's the first thing you picture in your mind? Close your eyes. What does a Star Wars fan look like? What are you picturing?
I'm picturing my he's going to be upset that I'm saying this. I'm picturing my partner, I'm picturing my co-host Chris, when he was sitting in line with his friends for the first one of the prequels, just like holding up a sign that was, I don't even remember what the sign said, but holding up a nerdy sign, sitting in line for hours and hours with his, similar nerdy friends waiting for the prequels.
And I bet in that picture you're picturing lightsabers, you're picturing stormtrooper outfits, you're picturing Jedi outfit. Yeah, right.
Yes.
If I say Star Trek fan, you're picturing Starfleet uniforms.
Yep.
If I say, yeah. So one of the big misconceptions people have is they conflate the trappings of the fan interest with the fan interest itself, right? So when I say furry, the first place people go is fursuits. That's the most visually iconic part of it. These full-body mascot-style suits. And that's wrong. That's not what most furries do. That would be like saying defining sport fans as people who wear jerseys. Certainly some sports fans have jerseys, but like your interest in sports can manifest as you watching the game with your friends every Sunday, right? Or you know. So we find that statistically only about a quarter to 1/3 of furries owns a fursuit. So most furries by definition do not. So I immediately know how much research an organization has done if they define furries as people who wear fursuits.
Okay.
Because again, when I hear that, I hear people say anime fans are people who cosplay, which is not the same thing.
Right.
So what is furry then, or what do furries do? They basically do the same things that any other fan group does. So if you picture what a science fiction fan or an anime fan does, they watch shows, right, that feature their favorite content. They do fan art, fan stories, fan fiction. They buy merchandise of their favorite shows and characters. They go on forums to argue about these things. They go to conventions to hang out with other fans. Some of them cosplay, some of them do not. But yeah, it's no different than what any other fandom does. If there's one thing that might make them kind of distinct, it's the creation of a persona. That's one of the most universal things we find in the fandom, which is the creation of a character or an avatar to represent yourself. And part of the reason for this is, again, the fandom started off as an online space. If it's in a muck or a chat room, you need a name, you need an avatar, a handle. And so furries like, okay, well, what's my name? What's my species? Let's draw a little picture for myself. So most furries will have a little character, a name, a species, a little backstory or something. And that's a little unique to the furry fandom, not totally unique. You see this in the brony fandom. You see this in some other fandoms. But that may be one of the things that most furries do first, is they come into the fandom and they immediately see everyone else has these characters. And so they say, well, I should get one too. And so they make themselves a little fursona. And from there, it's, do you go watch shows with other furries? Do you hang out with the artists? Do you hang out with the gamers? Because it's this big subculture with lots of little cultures inside of it, right? So you can be furry and only hang out with the furry gamers or the furry artists or the furry writers or the fans of a particular show. So there's lots of little communities within this one big community.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that I'm definitely somebody that, in the past, before, I totally conflated somebody having a fursona with somebody at least having the end goal of getting into a fursuit or creating a fursuit or having a fursuit that represented their fursona. And part of why I'm having this conversation is because I don't know that much about the furry community. But I do feel like I have learned that, like, it is more than just this, like, the most identifiable signifier of the fur fandom. Like, fursuits are cool, but yeah, it makes sense that wouldn't be necessarily the be all and end all. And
to be sure, a lot of furries want them. Like,
sure.
They don't necessarily have the $3,000 you need to get one, but a lot of furries would like them. Again, other furries don't, though. Some people want a jersey. Some people think they look stupid. Some furries really want a fursuit. Others are like, they creep me out, get them away from me.
Right. Where does one get a fursuit?
Typically, if you want to go for a fursuit, you either learn to make it yourself if you're thrifty and have some kind of artistic ability. More often than not, you go to a builder. So there are people who make very good money doing as a job building fursuits. for a living, right? So you'll find a builder you like. You'll typically get in a queue, and 6 months, a year, 2 years later, you got yourself a fursuit.
Just kind of thinking about the fursuits and what they represent in maybe mainstream society, I want to get into the question of, what do you think some of the stigmas, or what do you know, actually, some of the stigmas or biases against furries are out there? I think you definitely used the word stigma. You definitely used the word unflattering opinions. Like, what are some of those things? Like, why do those perceptions exist?
Funnily enough, I just published a paper on this recently, so it's fresh in my mind right now. Two of the main sources of misconceptions are the assumption that it's a weird sex fetish kink thing, or the assumption that these are people who've lost touch with reality. And so part of the reason is we have a tendency to try to explain behavior. We're all little natural psychologists, right? Even if you've never stepped foot in a psychology class, you are doing psychology. Anytime you see behavior, you need an explanation for it. And so when we see extreme or weird behavior, we feel like we need an extreme or weird explanation for it. So you see a person in a fursuit and you go, well, that's really different. You don't see that every day. And so an explanation like, oh, they must just like dogs or something doesn't seem sufficient, right? So you see, I need to go bigger in my explanation. And so we go to like two extreme places of deviance. Well, maybe it's a weird sex thing. Maybe they're putting that thing on to have sex with it, or with people in it. Or they go to the other extreme and say, man, that's a person who's lost touch with reality. They actually think they're a dog, and they don't realize they're not. And that's very creepy and weird. So that's the sort of two places that people go when trying to explain what the heck it is. And I think that because of that, a lot of the misconceptions people have, you see this perpetuated in the media. Right now, the phones keep ringing off the hook for us to talk to the media about this persistent rumor that's been going on now that, apparently furries in schools are asking for litter boxes.
Oh, God. I'm sorry you're getting those phone calls.
And it's I mean, no one can ever point to this. No one can ever find show me where this kid is. Show me where this parent is. Presumably, if this is happening everywhere, we should be able to put at least one parent or one kid in front of a video camera and get them to talk. And yet it's always a friend of a friend of a friend.
Right.
Or a teacher at a school over there that I've never talked to, but they mentioned it. And so, again, that's this idea of dysfunction, this belief that, well, this is a person who is barking in class because they don't realize they're not a human. This is a person who demands or insists to use a litter box. And it's so believable to people because, again, they need an extreme explanation for what they see as extreme behavior.
Right.
And on the flip side, that sex explanation, we saw this especially in the early 2000s. A lot of the media stories about furries was, look at these weirdos. Let's see if we can find if any of them have sex in those suits. Mm-hmm. Right. So they run around. There was the infamous CSI episode. Furries will always refer to it as the infamous CSI episode. Fur and Loathing, which was a clever furry pun. But basically it portrayed, they portrayed a furry convention in the show. And, when the characters walk in, it's just a bunch of people lying on top of each other in fursuits in this big orgiastic pile. And that was the portrayal of a furry convention.
Right.
The media certainly didn't help in latching on to these very easy, very believable misconceptions about the group.
That's something that definitely, when I was in high school or whatever, that was absolutely the perception that I was presented with, or the perception that I gleaned from society of like, this is solely a sex thing. Like, there would be people passing around like, oh, have you heard these terms that furries use for like their sexual whatever? And it took me a while, as somebody who is outside the community, it took me a while to realize that was just something that was being keyed on in such a small part of it. I think that your explanation of like, this is one of the only ways that like outsiders can internally explain this to themselves makes a lot of sense. Why do you think why do you think there's a lack of true curiosity about it from outside communities, like trying to explain it rather than just asking like, hey, what is this about?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And I actually covered it in that same paper that I got published. It makes us uncomfortable. So when you see people who are deviant from us, people who are or we perceive as being very different, we have negative emotional responses to it. Typically, we either feel very uncomfortable, like, ooh, I don't want that near me. or we feel like almost grossed out by it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's gross, or or you morally condemn it, right? So you're either indignant towards it if you think it's something negative, or you're grossed out and uncomfortable about it. So the emotions you tend to feel when you see this sort of thing are not usually good ones. They're not usually emotions that inspire you to go over and say, "Excuse me, old chap, what is this all about?" Right? It's
Right.
Like, "Oh, get the hell away from me! I don't want you sitting near me or my kid on the bus." Right? I don't know what you're doing in that thing, but it can't be good.
Right. Yeah, it's just so interesting to me. Like, I don't know, that lack of curiosity and that fear, it really can make our lives so much smaller. Like, can make our lives so much less colorful and have fewer outlets when we're so closed off from even the possibility that this is just like a cool thing that exists. It's, I don't know, that reaction's a bummer, but it does make me want to ask, and this is in the questions that I sent you. Mm-hmm. Even though there is this misconception, like this mainstream misconception that furry or being a furry is largely a sexual fetish, like even though that is actually a small draw, or maybe an almost non-existent draw to the community, like, can we talk about that aspect of this? Like, again, when I was talking to some of the contacts I made through our Empty Spaces episode, that was something that was brought up. Like, oh yeah, the overlap is because Empty Spaces is that's part of the community. It is largely about exploring sexuality and sex and that world. And so somebody that I was talking to said, yeah, the overlap exists. In this Discord that I'm in, there is a lot of like furry fan art and furry, like very sexual furry fan art. So
absolutely.
Talking about that with that community, like, how has the furry community become a safe space in some ways for sexual expression for some people?
Yeah. So one thing to clarify, this is one thing that people, including furries, will often get this one wrong. There's this tendency to sort of shoot too far in either direction, right?
Sure.
So there's this belief that either it is entirely a kink fetish thing, or on the flip side of thing to say, no, furry is absolutely chaste and pure and there's absolutely no sex to be found here, which is an equally ridiculous claim. So
sure.
The reality from some of our own data, 98% of furries look at furry-themed porn.
Okay.
It is there. So pornography is there. It's not hard to find. And people say, oh, well, how is that not a fetish then? To which my response is, if you were to look into the gamer fandom, so video gamers, mm-hmm. right? The character Lara Croft, right, has for many people been a pinup character, right? This, this character that gets sexualized and put on posters. It would be ridiculous for me to say, man, you've got a Lara Croft poster in your office. You must have a video game fetish.
Right.
That would be a very weird thing to say. Or to a football fan to say, man, you sure like those Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders. I guess you have some kind of a football fetish. Or you like those car magazines with the supermodel draped across the hood. I guess you've got a car fetish. Right? The reality is, humans are sexual creatures. We combine our naturally existing sex drive with our hobbies, whatever they are. The reason I would distinguish furry from being a fetish would be to say that sex isn't the major driver. So furries do look at erotic content. But when you ask furries, hey, is that the reason why you're here? Is that what got you into it in the first place? And, depending on the sample you're using, 60 to 80% of furries will say, no, I'm here for the community. I'm here for the costuming. I'm here for the content itself. I'm here for all these other things. The porn is there too.
Right.
But that's not why I'm here, right? To a gamer who has a pinup or who looks, for an anime fan who looks at hentai, right? The porn is there and they like that part. But, an anime fan would be offended to say, well, you're just a person with an anime fetish. No, they like anime and also, they have a healthy sex drive, so they combine the two. I would say it's probably correct to say that 10 to 15% of furries are primarily motivated by sexual interest. For 10 to 15% of furries, I think it would be accurate to say it is a fetish for them. And this is not kink shaming. That's if no one's getting hurt, you like what you like.
Right.
But I just think factually it would be inaccurate to assume that most furries are here first and foremost for the sex, right? You could take the sex out of furry entirely, and most furries would still be furries.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's almost kind of making me think about like the knee-jerk reaction, the knee-jerk inability to understand, from non-furry people, what's going on here. to come up with the idea or to cling to the perception that like this is largely a sex thing almost makes it easier to understand maybe in some ways. If you say like, no, it's actually not that might be harder for, it just goes back to your explanation of like why it goes, just maybe it's harder to wrap your mind around this if you don't understand it, and then also hear it's not actually a sex thing.
Well, that's why I think it's so useful to constantly be making comparisons to other fan groups that people do understand.
Right.
I can say, some of the original Star Trek fan fiction back in the 1960s and 70s was gay fan fiction written by female fans of Kirk and Spock.
Slash fiction, baby.
Yes, that's where slash fiction was born. And yet, we don't say, well, because this exists, because if I go into the Star Trek fan fiction boards, I find this slash fiction. We don't say, well, Star Trek fans are all tremendous perverts who have a Star Trek fetish, right? We don't do that for any other fan group. But furries are just weird enough. They cross that threshold that we go, oh, except for them, they're the weird sex freaks. We do the same thing for bronies, right? Yeah. So My Little Pony fans, right? Oh, you're an adult who likes this weird kids show? Well, this must be some weird sex thing too, right? Is there porn of it? Yes. Well, that's probably why you're there then. Let's ignore all the other content and all the other reasons why. Let's just focus on the porn. That has to be the reason you're there.
That's a really good point. And that honestly, like, as somebody who, again, has a very mainstream, my introduction to bronies was from a very mainstream perspective, like, that even helps me think about that a little differently. Like, that helps me think about it differently. I appreciate that. And it's also making me think about, like, and this is maybe related to the sex conversation or just the conversation around furries in general, is there some sort of spectrum here? Like, I know that there was a meme going around a while ago where it was like showing the spectrum of like furry to not furry in terms of like what you might find
dangerously furry, recklessly furry. Yeah.
It might have been that one, or it might have been another one. Like the one I'm specifically thinking of was it was showing the like progression of depicting someone as a cat girl. So it was like, here's a cat girl on this end, just cat ears. That's okay. And then progression until it was just a cat with like eyelashes. Yeah. What do you think about that spectrum? Like, is there a like if somebody goes like, oh, I really like myself in cat ears, is that person on the quote unquote furry spectrum?
Yeah. So the sort of two ideas that are conflated here. The one idea is the content itself. How anthro or feral is the content? That's the terms you would use. So the more it looks like a human with just a couple of animal traits, we'd say that's a much more anthro character. If it's like literally a dog, then that would be like feral.
Okay.
And so furries' interest in like content runs the whole gamut, right? So for some furries, their aesthetic preference is for very, like a werewolf that's very realistic looking. Whereas for other people, like myself included, like very toony art, like very cartoony, very Disney style, right? Like it's not at all realistic. The research tends to suggest that furries have a much stronger aesthetic preference for the much more toony style, which again makes sense if it's anthropomorphic animals you're a fan of and not just animals, then that would make a certain amount of sense. That's not to say there aren't furries who are very much a fan of the more feral style of art. It just tends to be less popular. So that's one dimension. So what kind of aesthetic preference do you have? But then the second one you're talking about, right, is a person who wears cat ears, a furry. Is a person who watches Zootopia considered a furry? And to that I would say that, at least as a social psychologist, the only way I answer that is, well, do you engage in the content enough that it becomes a part of who you are? At the end of the day, only you get to decide whether this label applies to you. Right? I can watch a few hockey games, but I don't consider myself to be a hockey fan. But if I watch it enough that I think you get a better understanding of me if I use the label hockey fan to describe myself, then I'll use it. But where that line is for everyone is different, right? So you can absolutely love My Little Pony and Zootopia and draw little animal characters, but just say something about furry just doesn't jive with me, though. The label doesn't fit me, right? I like these things, but I'm not a furry.
So for somebody who might be on that spectrum, asking themselves that question, can we talk about and we've touched on some things, but I want to get into it more. What are some of the benefits to people who engage in the furry community? Like, I know that obviously Fur Science has done a ton of research into this and has published a ton of research. And I think that this is something that has come up in your research, so I'd love to get into it.
Yeah, so right out of the gate, it's worth mentioning a distinction between two ideas. So there's what we call fanship and fandom. So fanship is how big of a fan are you, right? So if I'm high in fanship for Pokemon, if I'm high in Pokemon fanship, I buy all the games. I have posters and Pokemon cards all over my room. That would be very high in fanship, right? I watched every episode of the show. Fandom, on the other hand, is your involvement with the community itself, right? And you can be high or low in either one of these. I can watch the show religiously, I can have all the merchandise, but if I think Pokemon fans are cringe, then I would be low in fandom but high in fanship. Likewise, I can love hanging out with Pokemon fans, but not be super into the show. I just kind of like being around the fans, so I'd be high in fandom and low in fanship. They tend to be correlated, but they're different concepts.
Sure.
And I point this difference out because our research shows that fanship by itself isn't really tied to well-being one way or another, right? How big of a fan you are of something doesn't really have an impact on your well-being. Fandom, on the other hand, is tremendously predictive of well-being. So it's that community part of it. And part of the reason why this is the case, we often take it for granted that we have social support networks. One of the best predictors of well-being in a person's life is, do you have people who are there in your corner when the chips are down and life gets really tough? Do you have a couch to sleep on if your house burns down? Do you have a person who you can call if you get sick and have to go to the hospital? Can you borrow $100 from someone, right? That's social support. And for many people, they get that social support from their families, from their church groups, from their work friends, their school friends. But if you don't have that, life is a really bleak, dismal, scary place. And for a lot of people who were bullied and picked on and ostracized, they don't have that. And so their fan groups, their fandoms, for many of them, that's where they get that social support from. So when furries say it's the community and that's why I do it, well, that's what they're talking about. They're saying, yeah, like we used to get together to watch these shows or draw art together. But after a while, after I've gotten to know these people for a few years, like, we can hang out and furries not even the reason we're hanging out anymore. Like, my roommates are furries, right? We don't talk about all furry stuff all the time, but they're people who are furries. We hang out together a bunch, and now we're just like, they're like my found family. So that community becomes that social support for us. And again, if you already have that social support in other contexts, it can seem very silly. Like, how would you get something so significant from the people you watch My Little Pony with, or the people you go to a furry convention with? But unless you're in that community, unless these people are the people you lean on to get you through the day, you really can't appreciate what it means to be a part of that community.
Do you think then, and this is obviously a leading question, but do you think then that being a furry or being in the community is protective against things like suicide, mental illness, depression, the other, pitfalls of the human experience?
Well, 100%. Yeah, we've actually published a paper on that too in a social work journal, where we talked about how this is actually something that came up because we would have these furries who would go to clinical psychologists. They would go to therapy because, everyone goes to therapy for something, right? Or anyone can become depressed. Anyone can have an anxiety disorder, right? That's not unique to furries or anyone else. So we'd have these furries who would go to a psychologist because they have depression or they have an anxiety disorder. And the clinician would hear about them and say, well, tell me about yourself. And they would say, well, I'm a furry. And the clinician would say, okay, forget the depression stuff. Let's fix the furry thing, whatever this furry thing is, which is a real problem because if that's your social support network, if that's the people who are like your family, if those are the people who become your social resource, someone telling you that you have to get rid of this in your life because they don't know what it's about, is a really quick way to ensure that you don't go back to therapy. And this is what a lot of furries had happening. So we ended up publishing a journal to tell social workers and clinicians and practitioners, hey, this furry thing is actually really good for these folks, right? We have quotes from furries from interviews and focus groups saying like, hey, this literally saved my life. Like, I was going down a really dark road. I felt alone. I felt bullied. I felt like I didn't fit anywhere in the world. And here's this community that took me in under its shoulder. And, now I've got friends. Now I've got hopes for the future. I've got a place where I belong. These things that so many other people take for granted, they finally have that. So yeah, I think it's tremendously helpful for well-being. And as a testament to just how good it is for well-being, one of the things I like to point out is that we did a study looking at life satisfaction, self-esteem, well-being, comparing furries to non-furries. And we know from other research that bullying is one of the most wretched things you can do to a person. If you want to destroy a person's self-esteem and destroy their well-being, bully them for a few years.
Right.
So furries who have this history of being bullied about 50% more than the average person, by all accounts, they should be screwed up. You should be seeing all sorts of problems with them. And yet we don't see those. They were no different from our control groups in terms of life satisfaction and well-being. And we think it's precisely because the fandom provides this insulating protective factor for them.
Yeah, that I feel like we could all use a little bit of that. In life today, it's just community is something that is so hard to find. Like even when you have that, you have a family of origin, you have these things, like community is something that is really slipping away. So it makes sense that community here is protective.
Well, and the research is abysmal right now the research is not abysmal. The findings are abysmal and terrifying when you see how many young adults today say they don't have a single friend.
Right.
Right. Or that they don't, they can go an entire day without speaking to a single person. And that's just becoming more and more common. Right. I think there's a bigger need, if anything, for people today to find those communities, however you find it, right? Whether it's the people you go to church with or the people you watch a TV show with, we are a social species. We need to be in little tribes with other people. And if we don't have that, it's bad for our well-being.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I just feel like that's getting more and more apparent every day, which just makes me appreciate these communities more so than ever. Do you think that the widespread perception or opinion, either amongst therapists or just amongst mainstream society, is changing in response to your work? Or, how do you see that widespread perception shifting, if at all?
Yeah, so I think you can actually trace in the media from like the late 1990s and 2000s to today, there's been an evolution in the way we talk about furries. Initially, it was like, hey, look at these freaks. Like, let's put these freaks on display and let's show just how weird and deep that rabbit hole goes, right? I'm going to sneak into a furry convention. I'm going to run around in all the back corridors and try to find someone doing something insidious in a fursuit. That's sort of how it started off. And then sort of throughout the mid-2010s, the story shifted to, hey, look at these freaks and these weirdos, but that's okay.
Right.
But it still became the sensationalizing of, man, these guys are really real freaks and weirdos. But I, the good, intrepid reporter, I'm going to say they're weird, but that's okay. They're not so different from us. More recently now, I'm happy to see that the story is slowly changing into a recognition that they're not so different from anyone else. Like, if there's a story to be had with the furry fandom, it's that the differences between a furry and a science fiction fan and a football fan are purely aesthetic. It's the difference between liking chocolate and liking vanilla, right? One group likes to watch stories that feature walking, talking animals, and one group like to inflate a pigskin and smash into each other at high speeds, right? They're both equally arbitrary things to want to do for fun.
Right.
It's just, one of them has gained mainstream appeal. But I think as we start to understand that, hey, people can like atypical things, and that's okay. As we're starting to see more and more people being like 40 and 50-year-old Star Wars fans and Doctor Who fans, and as we see Marvel movies becoming multi-billion-dollar mainstream enterprises, I think it's becoming more acceptable for people to let their fan freak flag fly a bit, and we're starting to say, well, okay, it's it's a little strange, but it's not that strange in the scheme of things.
I mean, and maybe it's like where I would like to see it go is with furries, with anything we've talked about on the show that we've decided is like, this is a good thing. I want to see it go towards, it's not that it's like, it's not so bad. This is good. Like, we should be we should be more open to exploring the like various, just the creative ways to be a human in this world. Like, it should not be that you just exist in exactly the prescribed way. Like, that is so boring, and I really do think it is detrimental to our existence in a lot of ways. So like, I just wish that people could be more presented with these options of like, you could be it's not just about, you can be a Marvel fan because the movies are big now. It's like, you can be a furry, you can be in Empty Spaces, you can be like, the Tulpas was one of our really big episodes that we love. And I think about that all the time because what we learned was that, adults with quote unquote imaginary friends or kids that had imaginary friends, it has so much benefit. Like, it has benefits on creativity. It has benefits on all of the things that you and I have talked about. Yes. Like, I would like to see it move beyond like, well, it's okay that we have these weirdos around to like, let's encourage people to be the weirdos. Like, it's not that it's okay. It's like, let's do it.
I like to see the day where a kid can come home and say, well, I discovered today, Mom and Dad, I discovered today that I'm a furry, and have them go, oh, cool, as opposed to like, oh, well, okay, we'll learn to live with this, but they go, oh, that's awesome. Right. Have that be a thing that you're excited that your kid has found out about themselves.
Right. And just like makes life a little bit more interesting and a little bit less dull and hard. This might be a very off-topic question, but can you talk a little bit about why it seems like there, in this day and age, and I'm sure in always, there is a continual problem that pops up in fandoms of a tendency towards fascism. And it seems like the furry community, from things that I've heard, things that I've read, that the furry community has been largely successful in rejecting fascism from its community. Like, why, how and why, and how do we do it?
Yeah, so I think it's, you'll politics will enter into any fan space eventually, right? This is certainly not unique to the furry fandom. Again, I studying the My Little Pony fandom, there's an original character who is a Nazi character, right? Who was the subject of tremendous controversy, right? Nazi ponies in the My Little Pony fandom, right? So you can't get away with this, can't get away from this no matter where you go.
Right.
I feel like a big part of it is the norms that are in place. So again, I'm speaking as a social psychologist. A community's norms are hugely influential on how the average person responds and reacts. So insofar as I see myself as a furry, whatever the furry's norms are seen as being, I generally tend to endorse those. And so one of the big norms of the furry fandom is global citizenship, inclusion, right? Everyone from different walks of life, diversity is important. And so that's a really important central theme to the furry fandom. Now, because there's no governing body that decides who gets to count as a furry or not, you'll have people who say, well, I'm a furry because I liked a particular show, or I liked, this particular thing. So they identify as furries, but they don't necessarily identify with those norms of the fandom, right? So maybe your politics are decidedly alt-right and you happen to like a particular furry show. Maybe you grew up liking video games, but you don't get behind any of the rest of the furry stuff. In that regard, it's possible to consider yourself a furry, but sort of be at odds with the politics of the general furry community. One of the things that's been really nice to see in the furry fandom is they're not shy about espousing those norms and making it very loud and clear that, hey, this is the norm of the fandom, right? If you're going to start spreading that fascist shit here, it's really not welcome. And because so much of the fandom takes place in online spaces, right? If you're ostracized or kicked out of the online community, that doesn't leave you with a lot of places to go. So yeah, we've seen that happen, right? There have been some small discussions in the fandom about, what is to be done about these groups. And I think the overwhelming response from the fandom has been there's zero tolerance policy, right? If furries are not shy about saying, we'll boycott organizations that accept this. We will we will leave artists who espouse these kinds of views. We will, so that there's a big push to try to make this space a space where fascism really doesn't even get a chance to take root, really. And you've seen that this incredibly strong backlash. So it doesn't even get a chance to take root and become something that is seen as even remotely viable. And again, it doesn't in some ways, it always kind of makes me laugh that a person with fascist views would even want to be in the furry fandom in the first place. It's like, my dude, this is an LGBTQ plus space. Like, right. You are, if you hate, gay people or think trans people are degenerate or something, I hate to break it to you, but you are in a numerical minority from the get-go, right? This is, not a place where you're going to find a lot of people who think like you.
Right.
So
yeah,
they often get stamped out pretty quickly.
I have a lot of respect for that because it is such a problem in communities in general. But it's been heartening to see over the last few years. Like, I feel like that those are more of the news stories that I've been exposed to, at least, via Twitter, is just, hey, this furry convention, like, kicked out this, guy in a Nazi fursuit. And I'm like, yes, yep. Please, more of that.
Well, it's funny, too, because, I mean, there's always... To argue that there won't be any drama in any fandom is silly, right? Furry has just as much drama as any other fandom does. But right. What's interesting is that, like, the things that make it to the point of drama or high drama in the furry fandom are relatively small when you compare it to other fandoms, right? So in the furry fandom, we might say we have a problem with Nazis because a Nazi furry came to a convention, right? Mm-hmm. Or, a couple of people made some fascist art, right? We have a problem with Nazis in this fandom. When you compare it to other fandoms where it is a much, much more significant, much more deeply rooted problem. So it's you always hate to see any sign of this in a fandom, but the fact that the fandom can get very upset and very passionate over what is relatively speaking a very, very small number of people,
right?
Is encouraging, right? It doesn't get a chance to take root.
Right. Yeah. Again, more of that. Take notes, everybody from other fandoms that is listening right now. Maybe we've hit on everything, but I just feel like I need to ask, like, what do you want mainstream society to know about furries? Like, if you could pick, top 3 things, like, what do you want people who don't know anything to know about this group?
I don't even know about necessarily 3 things. I would say if there's one thing to take away, it's that, like, furries are just like you. We have a campaign that we kind of jokingly say is they're just like you, but with more fur, right? At the end of the day, the difference between a furry, an anime fan, a brony, a football fan, it's just an aesthetic preference, right? The underlying psychology, the reason why you're a fan of these things is the same, right? You're in it for a recreation. You do it because it's fun. You do it because the community is fun. You do it for a little bit of escapism, right? You do it to flex some of those self-expression or creativity muscles. Those same underlying psychological motivations are there. So the differences are quite literally skin deep here, right? They're small, superficial aesthetic differences. We have a lot more in common than you might think. And when you keep that in mind, it's a lot easier, especially if you're a fan of anything, right? If you're a fan of something, I feel like you can understand a furry.
Yeah, if you can understand anything, yeah, that's... I'm going to be thinking about that one for a while. So this is the question that I have to ask everybody that we talk to. From an outsider's perspective, the furry community may seem unusual, unfamiliar beliefs, strange rituals. We are a cult podcast. We are cult or just weird. So I have to ask, is the fur fandom a cult or is it just weird? And to clarify on our show, weird is it's a wonderful term of endearment.
Oh, furries are absolutely weird. It's funny, anticipating this question, I actually, nerdy psychologist that I am, I actually went and looked up Lifton's criteria for, like, what makes a cult, just to make sure. And I feel like furries only have, like, one of the defining features of a cult out of, like, 8. So the one feature was, like, they have their own language and jargon, right? Okay. Which I think most fandoms do. So furries are, like, maybe, like, 1/8 of the way there to a cult. So much more likely to be weird than any sort of cult.
What kind of jargon? Like, I know we've said furry a number of times, but, like, what other jargon is there? You did say anthro versus feral, which was new for me.
Yeah.
But
anthro versus feral, fursonas are a big deal. Furries love their puns, which I think a lot of people underestimate. So someone will be like, they think they'll be very clever, and they'll be like, does that make you ferocious? Aren't I clever? And like when you look at how we name our conventions, like further, confusion, fernal, equinox, furthermore, like you're not going to beat furries at this. This is kind of our thing. So tons of language, fursuits, right? There's a lot of jargon when you get into it. Of course, now all of it is escaping.
Gotcha. No, that's a lot, and that does not a cult make. So obviously, Chris and I will talk about it as well. But does not seem like a cult. Seems just like wonderfully weird. Is there anything that we didn't cover today that you would like our listeners to know, or that you'd like to say?
No, I think I love the questions you asked. You asked questions that I think were very they show that you've done some research. Again, it's always frustrating to do interviews where, the questions themselves are very ignorant and come from a place of like, your confirmation bias. You're digging for the thing you already think to be true, and nothing I say is going to change your belief that furries are sexual degenerates or something. So
I'm sorry.
It was nice to see.
I'm sorry you've had that experience in interviews. That's a bummer. That is a bummer.
It comes with the territory.
Sure. So where can our listeners find you? Where can they find your work, your research? Like what resources would you like to point them towards?
Yeah, so I think the easiest, best place to find us is just furscience.com. So FURscience.com. We make all of our findings available there. So we run and maintain a repository of all of our past findings. We have a book. It's now out of date there. It's like 6 years out of date. We are currently writing a new book, which we hope will be out sometime in the spring. But it's going to be everything we've learned with the fandom condensed into like one book with all the numbers, data, statistics, and we make it available for free. We don't think that this information should be kept behind a paywall. So it's very important to us to get it out there. So if you want to win internet arguments about furries, check out Fur Science. You can follow us on Twitter at Fur Science, or Facebook. I think we're also on Facebook as well as Fur Science. So
that is a good motivation to get people to check out the research, win internet arguments. That automatically made me go like, oh yeah, let's go. Dr. Plant, thank you so much for talking with me today, for being on our show. I feel like I learned a lot and just have a much more well-rounded education about the furry fandom.
The pleasure's all mine, Kayla. Thank you very much for having me.
Kayla, seriously, you had to give up the goods on my waiting in line for the prequels back in 1999 when like half of our audience probably wasn't even born.
Very sorry.
And here's the thing.
He said, what's a Star Wars fan? And I went, that's a Star Wars fan.
Yeah, you didn't have to go into detail about it. Everybody thought I was cool, and now people are going to think that I'm a big dork.
Nobody thought you were cool.
Yeah, no, I know. And actually, I wouldn't even be upset about it, except it's the prequel. But see, the thing is, people today can't understand what the mentality was like back then, okay? Mm-hmm. Today, we are just inundated with Star Wars content. We are being force-fed Star Wars content like a fucking goose that they're trying to make foie gras out of.
We do have fatty livers.
We have fatty Star Wars livers. In 1999, it was like, I can't believe there's going to be another Star Wars.
Yeah, I know.
It's unbelievable. Like, especially like I wasn't born.
The 3 Star Warses.
Right. And then like that's it. And then the holiday special.
Holiday special, which no one could get a hold of.
And Star Tours at Disney. Like
Star Tours at Disney. There were the Endor movies that
there were a bunch of things that like nobody really
and none of them were like quote unquote quality.
There was fanship stuff, to use the word that I just learned.
There you go.
Right, people could buy like action figures and stuff, but in terms of like actual like
mainstream
storytelling content media, there was like a drought. And like for me, who was born in 1981, like 2 of the Star Wars movies came out already. Like for me, it was like, oh my God, there's an original Star Wars, like a piece of the canon that's going to be put into my eyeballs. It was unbelievable, and then the movie sucked. So I don't know.
Sorry.
I mean, I don't want to get off topic.
We're here to talk about Star Wars.
Okay, we're not here to talk about Star Wars. It didn't entirely suck. Duel of the Fates was cool. It was a different time, and we were all obsessed. And I watched the movie 9 times in theaters. And then I realized that it was bad, and then now I'm embarrassed by it. But thank you for putting it out there in the world. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Aside from that, okay, lots to unpack there. Mm-hmm. I think my big takeaway was something that was sort of like dawning on me as... There's a lot of takeaways, but if I had to boil it down, if I had to stack rank, my biggest one is... like we're all furries, like how ubiquitous this thing is, like,
yeah.
And that was kind of dawning on me at the beginning of the interview, before you guys even like explicitly talked about it. It was kind of dawning on me about the like, oh yeah, there's Bugs Bunny and Mickey Mouse in every single Disney movie
of anthropomorphic animals.
Right, anthropomorphized animals are like everywhere, and like he put later with other cultures too, like.
Right.
So many deities are anthropomorphized humans, like shape-shifting, like werewolves.
Right.
I mean, like I don't want to sit here and just like name stuff, but like it's like half of all storytelling if you think about it, right? Centaurs, I don't know. Like it's just everywhere. And so when I started thinking about that, I was like, wait, this is actually like super normal?
Yeah, it's
like it's weird and normal. It's like it's definitely weird, like he says, it's weird in a good way, but it's also like it's not what's the word I'm looking for?
Niche.
It's not niche. It's definitely not.
It's not. It seems niche because for some reason the expression of being a fan of this in this way is quote unquote niche, but the actual fanship itself, that's not niche at all.
Yeah, I feel
every
like
Disney movie.
You're right. It's the identity part of it, right? It's the like I identify as I am explicitly acknowledging that I am a fan of this concept of this thing that I think is not something that most people consciously do, at least.
Right.
And I think that the other thing that kind of plays into it is the misconception that I had corrected in this interview, which is that like, yeah, it's totally just people that like want to dress up as dogs and cats when they bone.
Right.
Like literally that, I hate to say it, I really do hate to admit it, that was the impression that I had. I had the impression, and like maybe not 100%, but like first and foremost, it's a sexual kink community,
right.
where like people that like to have sex in fursuits hang out.
Right.
I did not know that it was more of like his sports fan analogy.
Right.
And sort of same thing goes with the jerseys. Like I would have, if you asked me before the interview, I would have said like, yeah, furries are people that like to dress up in fursuits.
Right.
Totally had that corrected for me too.
Because that's what's been expressed to you by the loudest voices in your circle on this, which are not furry voices.
Right.
And I think that that's just a good example of like, if we have questions about a community, like get your info from the community, like see what they're talking about, not necessarily what's being depicted on CSI or in your local evening news or from like, 4chan memes making fun of it. It's really easy to have your entire opinion on this thing colored by those outside sources that have a reason for wanting to be unflattering.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I know about that CSI episode. Like I've heard of it at least.
Sure, me too.
I've never seen a single episode of CSI. But when you guys brought that up, I was like, why do I know about that? That also brings me to another point, which we were chatting about sort of as we were listening to this. But like, damn, good find for an interview. This is like the ideal person to talk to because he's got the two magical components. He's got the lived experience, and he's got the like scientific, like studious, I want to learn about this curiosity
research,
approach,
reality-based approach to something. Yeah.
So it was a really good interview. So
it was really difficult.
Thank you for talking to him.
Thank you for listening. It was really difficult trying to figure out how to approach this episode because it is such a large topic. Like approaching any sort of fandom, that's a huge undertaking. And so I was thinking about like, how do I want to do this? Do I want to, approach it the same way that I approach tulpas and like go onto the Reddit? Do I want, that which yielded, I'm so glad we talked to so many tulpas, but my research for the tulpa episode yielded more information than I could sift through. And so how could I present this in a way that was like...
You should have created a tulpa to help you sift through it.
How could I present this in a way that was like both curated and comprehensive? And finding somebody who was doing research into it felt like one of the best ways to do that. And finding somebody who is doing that and is also actively a furry, it's like... I could not have asked for a better interview. Yeah,
it was perfect. And also he's a gamer too, so like check. Although I did feel very sort of like, I don't know, what's the word? What's that word when it's like you just kind of feel like everyone else, like somebody just has you pegged? When he was talking about like, well, it's like kind of nerd culture and like you're going to like these 5 things. And I'm like, yeah, but I like those 5 things just because I like them, not because it's part of my nerd culture. Like I just like them.
Are you a furry?
Maybe I am. I don't know. But like, I like anime. I like video games. I like Star Trek and Star Wars. I do like fantasy. I can't deny it.
You like a girl with cat ears.
I do. Yeah.
Don't we all?
Well, so and then to answer like, am I a furry? Like for the first time, I actually thought about that instead of being like, no, I'm not a furry.
Right.
Because now instead of my understanding being like, I like to dress up and maybe like, bone somebody with fox ears on. Instead, now I'm thinking of it as like, do I think anthropomorphized animals are interesting and neat and cool? Yeah.
Yeah, I think
I love Disney movies.
The answer is, now is the time to evaluate your fanship and fandom of furries. Like, no, I'm not saying do that on the show. I'm just saying instead of now. Having that knee-jerk reaction, it just kind of makes more sense to sit down and evaluate your own relationship to how you feel about anthropomorphic animals. Not fursuits, not that stuff, but like, how do anthropomorphic animals show up in your life? Do you like Disney movies? I know we're kind of repeating ourselves here, but yeah, do you like Disney movies? Did you like Zootopia? Are you a fan of, I don't know, is Gritty a furry? I don't think so, but like...
Gritty is his own genre.
Is Gritty his own genre?
It's something.
Like, what are the ways that this does show up for you?
Yeah.
Not necessarily you, I'm just saying in general.
One person. Mm-hmm. You, listener. And like, honestly, sometimes cat ears can be kind of cute. Like, I'm not going to lie.
It's a whole
thing.
thing.
Sometimes it can be kind of sexy. I know.
That's a thing.
I'm not going to lie about it.
And that's kind of why I wanted to ask him about that spectrum that was going around of like, a girl with cat ears is totally fine, but a cat is not fine. And kind of like, what are you talking about?
Don't fuck your cat. But girl with cat ears.
Like, and I know I've had this conversation before in our friend group, but like, if you are somebody who is going, I like this depiction of a girl who is part cat, and the part cat is a tail and cat ears, I don't think you get to then, quote unquote, have some sort of like moral high ground over somebody who is interested in a more feral or or less anthro looking depiction of a cat person. Mm-hmm. I just don't.
Yeah.
Not to make it about the sex. It's not even about the sex. It's just I like the way that looks. You're engaging in the same thing. I just want to break down that imaginary barrier a little bit. And maybe if you're sitting at home going, well, I like cat ears. I put cat ears on at Halloween, but I'm not a furry. Maybe think about why you think it's shameful to be a furry. You don't have to be a furry. Like Dr. Plant talked about that. Like, maybe it's just not a label that applies to you. But maybe think about why it might feel like something that is wrong or embarrassing or shameful to you. Because maybe you can just not be those things. It's just something that you're not into. It's okay.
I think you're right. And I've actually been thinking a lot about this question. We talked a little bit about it during the interview in response to one of the things that he was saying. I think there's also an element of what you were just talking. So what you were just talking about was, do I just like to put on furry ears, or am I a furry? And I think that those are like, there's actually like a really big psychological barrier between those two states. Like, I think there's like a threshold to be crossed, and weirdly it reminds me of when we were talking to Molly Maeve Egan about history of sexual abuse. There was like a threshold crossing moment when you kind of go from like, this is a thing that happened to me, to like, this is like an identity. This is like, I am a victim, right? Like, I am a survivor of this thing. And it kind of feels, I don't know why that feels similar to me, but there's like this identity threshold crossing that seems to be like, and totally wildly different like things to have happen, obviously. But I don't know. I feel like that's another part of it with the furry thing, right? It's one thing to say I like something. It's a different thing to say like, I am someone who likes this something.
Right. And both are stigmatized identities that carry a lot of, can perhaps, I don't want to say carry a lot of shame, because I don't want to say that furries are ashamed. I don't think that people who are furries are ashamed. I think that people who have negative feelings about furries might harbor some shame about that, or think that it's shameful. I just think that just try and, you don't have to identify as it, but try and examine why that shame is there. Yeah. And maybe just don't have it be there. Like, I know that's easier said than done.
Just
but
don't feel shame, you guys. Just stop.
It doesn't have to be a thing of shame for it to not be something that you identify with.
I do also like what he was saying too about like there's also like gradations of identity too, and he was mentioning how these conventions as sort of, you know, safe spaces allow people to sort of like try on different identities, to kind of be like, do I like this? Do I like this pronoun? Do I like thinking of it? I don't know. This is a place where I can try it on, right? Like, so
what an important
that's a super
thing.
super interesting, super important. Like I think that's like a cool, because of the sort of like thresholdy nature of like these identities, right? Of like, oh man, I don't just like to wear ears now. I am a furry. Or, oh man, like I don't just think boys are cute. Like I actually am a gay person.
Right.
Being able to sort of like try that on in a safe way and like, you know what? No harm, no foul. Like, go kiss a dude. Like, I don't know. Maybe you like it. Who knows?
Right.
Yeah. Super good to have shit like that.
Yeah. It's a net positive for society.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And apparently I didn't know that they were so good at expunging all the because I had heard about the fascism.
Sure.
I know I joked about it up front. Apologies to our furry listeners who might have been offended by that, but it's really nice to hear like that they so vigorously sort of like eliminated that aspect.
Sure.
And yeah, it is weird too. Like he was mentioning, like why would you want to, as a fascist, like be amongst? I don't know.
Yeah, it's weird, but I mean,
that's its own whole discussion.
You're always going to find people with a tendency towards fascism in a lot of like in groups. Like it's a thing that exists. With anything else, yeah. Especially when it's like, I don't know if furries are largely white, but I'm sure there's plenty of white people. I'm not saying that white people are fascists.
You're saying white people are weirdos.
Not saying that. I'm just saying that that can be an indicator of the potential towards.
There's a correlation between
belief
white
system.
people and white supremacy. More white people are going to be white supremacists than not. So
good job, furries.
Good job, furries. Yeah, great interview. I don't have anything else to say. Is it a cult or just weird?
We talked about it in the interview, but you and I have to go through our own criteria.
We do. Yeah, I noticed that he went to like some Lifton? Who the hell is that?
I don't know.
He should have come to our. That's actually kind of a famous cult researcher, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
But really, he should have come to our show. And go, do we have
our completely not? He went to something academic versus our completely non-academic.
Yeah. He should have
criterions.
Fucking academics.
So, first one is charismatic leader.
Is it this guy? By the way, I love that there's like a whole group. What is it called? Fur Science?
Fur Science.
I just think that's really cool too.
I know.
Just that there's like a whole group, and it's like interdisciplinary, and it's
it's very
so
cool.
tasty.
Go check out their website and the work that they do.
Yeah, so it doesn't seem like there is anyone.
I did not
really
come across a charismatic leader. It's more of an emergent group. There are obviously like more famous furries and furry leaders and people who are organizing conventions and stuff like that.
But there's not like a king of the furries.
Not that I discovered.
What about Robin Hood from the Disney Robin Hood?
He is my king of furries.
He's like the furry god king, right?
I really do love him.
He's hot as fuck.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Expected harm.
It seems opposite.
Opposite, baby.
Yeah. Especially based on like that last part of the interview you're talking about. It seems like it's actually of great benefit to these
Expected
people.
benefit.
And it really sucks that like there was and or is a time that like therapists and social workers would
try to treat the furry.
Yeah, try to treat it as a disorder. Like I guess I get it, but like that sucks.
Yeah, not a fan. I hope that is changing. Presence of ritual.
Oh yeah.
High.
Yeah.
Go to the conventions. You have the jargon. You have the different ways of engaging in fandom and fanship. It's up there. Fursuits.
People in the community will dress up in fursuits. Yeah. That's high ritual.
Presence of ritual high. Niche within society. This is going to be an interesting one. Well, I disagree.
Okay. I
disagree.
See it both ways.
I think that the discrete community that we are talking about right now of people who self-identify as furries and engage in the fandom, engage in the community, like go to the conventions or make fan art or talk to each other online. I think that is still, even though it's, well-known on 4chan or whatever, well-known on Reddit, was on a CSI episode. It is still niche within society.
Yeah, I think that when you really sit down and like define the borders that way, which I think we kind of have to, I think you're right.
Anthropomorphized animals?
With a little asterisk that says everybody loves anthropomorphized animals. Everybody that has ever lived likes anthropomorphized animals.
Anti-factuality.
I
don't see that here.
I don't see where that would come in.
Because again, Dr. Plant, like, very much clarified, like, this is not necessarily about people who are having some sort of, like, identity crisis or are disconnected from their humanity. Like, it's not, that doesn't seem to be a part of it.
The only anti-factual bits, in fact, that I can remember are, like, the misconceptions that exist and that I personally had.
Life consumption, percentage of life consumed.
Ooh, did you even ask him that?
I didn't, and I think that with any kind of fandom, I don't see how this answer can't be like it depends.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's anywhere from like 0 to 100.
Yeah,
right?
like we've talked about fanship versus fandom, talked about how you can be just a casual enjoyer of something versus like heavily engaged in fanship and fandom. I don't really know how to answer that one besides like yes, no.
Yeah, I feel like
perhaps not.
You can go to like one convention a year, and then it's like 2% of your life.
Right.
It's like I'm going to these things all the time, and all I think about, which is not even necessarily bad, right? This is inherently, it's a neutral criterion, even though typically it's in harmful groups, it's not great. But in this case, yeah, it definitely seems. Yeah, it depends.
Dogmatic beliefs? Dog.
Yes. Hi, dogmatic beliefs.
No.
And also hi, catmatic beliefs. Avians sounds like a little lower down the list. What about, he didn't answer you about the killer whale thing, because I like that.
I get the sense that the killer whale is not super high up there.
Okay, I think that's what I would want to be. No, I'd probably be a bear.
You'd be bear?
I think I'm already a bear.
You are a bear.
I'm glad that you told him about We Bare Bears.
We Bare Bears is one of my favorite shows right now.
We Bare Bears is excellent.
Anthropomorphic animals.
It is a children's show that is very just pleasant and
so pleasant,
calming to watch.
Yes,
for adults.
It is soothing for the nervous system. Dogmatic beliefs is low.
Okay, if we don't pun it, then yeah, fine.
Chain of victims.
I can't think of a pun for this one. But it doesn't seem like it's a recruity kind of deal.
Agreed. Doesn't seem like it's a victimizy kind of deal.
Yeah. It's neither really.
So no. Last one.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't really get into it, but I think we can extrapolate. Safe or unsafe to exit?
I don't get the impression that you're going to get like ostracized or punished if you leave.
I think the only kind of unsafe exit present here is if you were somebody who, unfortunately had a therapist that tried to treat you out of the community and then you lost your social safety net, but that's not really the community's fault. So I don't think that there is an unsafe exit involved in the furry fandom.
Yeah, I get the impression. I like the social safety net way of looking at it. Like I get the impression, and in fact, I think he even kind of mentioned this a little bit, that people essentially just sort of become friends regardless of the community over time.
Right.
Right? It's like with the sports fandom, right? Like I go and watch the Gator game with people, and then like 10 years go by, and now I'm friends with Steve, like,
yeah, Steve. I love Steve. One of your best buddies.
Gator Steve. So, and I that seems to me to be sort of like the safety net would still be there, even if you don't you stop going to conventions, but you still see Steve on the weekends.
Right.
Steve would be a furry who dresses up as a gator.
As a gator.
By the way,
that would be a really cool outfit.
Speaking of which, and that's another overlap. Every single sports team has a furry,
except for Gritty.
Gritty is his own thing. But every other sports team has somebody that dresses up like an anthropomorphized animal.
We love them.
So there you go. It's like if you have one, it's totally normal. But if everybody's doing that,
we freak out. That's when then we just
go wild.
So not a cult. We agree with Dr. Plant. It is just weird.
It's just weird. And as you said with him, weird is cool.
I'm really grateful to have had this conversation. Like, it feels really good to maybe help demystify like a somewhat maligned group and do a little bit to maybe help present it as something like the positive, beneficial thing for society and for individuals that it is. Mm-hmm. I'm also really grateful that like actual scientific research is going into this. So again, thank you to Dr. Courtney Plante for this conversation, and also to all of his colleagues at Fur Science for the work that they're doing. That's it for me today. Do you have anything else? I have something to leave us on, but I
was just going to echo your sentiments and say, like, I'm glad that I love when I have misconceptions corrected, or when I learn new things that I didn't know before. And also, like, specifically with furries, like several other, like, I didn't know anything about tulpas really until you did your episode. I hadn't even heard of empty spaces until you did your episode. Furries, on the other hand, when you asked me back at the top of the episode what I thought about furries, and then you asked me, but what do I actually know?
Right.
Two very different answers. And like, I guess what I'm trying to say is, for something that I feel like I had knowledge about, I totally didn't. And I really appreciate getting the goods, getting the actual knowledge from the scientist's mouth.
Me too. I want to leave us today with this quote from Rod O'Reilly, who is a furry themselves, in a documentary called The Fandom, a furry documentary, just to give us some more food for thought about the furry fandom. Quote, "There's this weird thing that humans do. We take animals and we put our words into their mouths to talk back to us, usually about us. It's a very strange thing, but we've done it for centuries. We learned to read from anthropomorphic animals. We learn right from wrong from anthropomorphic animals. But most people don't notice it. Furry fans are the people who notice that we do this and think that there's something really special about that."
Damn.
This is Kayla.
This is Chris.
And this is Cult or Just
Weird
Furry.